in the business you're in because you believe, and I assume I'm speaking correctly for you, that the prosperity of our country really depends largely on the development of our next generation of young people. That we need to do, if we are going to do well as a city, as a nation, in the world, we are going to have to be sure that the next generation of children grow up competent to become adults and competent to be able to raise the generation after that. In fact, many of the things you deal with are the result of young children growing up under harsh conditions, having their emotional and cognitive development influenced negatively by those conditions, and now having to provide support for the next generation without having the necessary tools that they need from their own background. So that's what we're about here, is trying to improve the state of our county, of our state, and of our nation. It takes more than good genes to grow a healthy brain. It takes having the right supportive experiences. And in fact, one of the very exciting areas of research right now is called epigenetics. It's the evidence that experience is very important in actually regulating the way our genes turn on and off. So it's not just the genes you inherit, but your experiences actually influence the way your genes operate. So yes, it's nice to get a good set of genes, but in order to have the fullest extent possible of achievement from those genes, you need to also have the right supportive experiences. I should stop just briefly and let you know where the information is coming from that I'm giving to you today. This is both work that is being done at the Institute of Child Development and other places at the university, but it's also broader than that. The National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, of which I'm a member, is a group of scientists drawn from across the country. We were first put together by the National Academy of Science over a decade ago to produce, to review everything that we knew about early development and to produce a document to guide the country's response, or how we would deal with that information. And that document, some of you might know as Neurons to Neighborhoods. We stayed together after that with support from the baby Buffetts, not the big Buffett, but his kids, their funding, to be able to continue to vet the science. And so what I'm bringing to you today is what 99% of developmental scientists would agree is accurate information. It's not one person or even the Institute's view. It's, you can take this to the bank as what science believes is true. Okay, so why does it take more than just good genes to develop a healthy brain? One of the things that we know is that genes are very important in laying out the basic architecture of the brain, where certain kinds of neurons are going to be in your brain. But once those neurons get there, it's experience, it's their activity that wires them up. This is an example of this. So what you're looking at here are, if you can see the little dot, this is if I were to take a little slice out of the prefrontal, the front part of the brain, in a newborn baby, and of course sadly this was babies who died at birth so that this happened and they were able to look at their cells. These are nerves. And what you're seeing, this is the body of the nerve, and this is the long axon, maybe you learned about in biology. These are the dendrites, and what you probably, I'm sure, remembered is that nerves work because they talk to one another. They send signals down one, they hop to the next, and then they can produce an action. And what you're noticing, I hope here, is they aren't touching, right? There's no connections. That's fine. You use this part of your brain to do things like algebra, not something known that newborns are doing much of. But what will happen over time in this region of the brain, under genetic control, at a certain point, suddenly, all these connections will occur. And their peak activity of making those connections in this region of the brain at around age 6. And then, and this is not great, you don't think really well with all these connections because they're noisy. What you're going to do then over time is the connections that talk to one another effectively to produce an action or a thought that's useful, they'll stay, and the others will fall away. This is a wonderful way that nature has figured out to be able to adapt us to the context in which we're growing up and functioning, right? And not to have all of that in our genome. So if you look at 14 years of age, there are fewer connections, but the connections that these are actually very working, functional connections. And the sculpting actually in this part of the brain goes on until about your 16, 17 years of age. And then after that, you're finishing off the white matter going along with this, and then your brain finally reaches maturity at 25, and then it starts going the other direction. True. But keep using it. It will stay younger longer. Brain development occurs in stages. We wire our brain, in a sense, from the bottom up, from simpler skills to higher order skills. So it's the back part of your brain that is going through that proliferation and pruning, the part that has to do with sensory processing, vision, hearing. Right, that's what happens. Babies get better and better at doing that. And then we begin to get to the regions in the temporal area and so on that are involved in establishing language, right? And then we get to those higher order reads that take longer to sculpt. But the important thing to notice here is so much of this basic setup is happening in the first years of life. And we organize our higher reasoning based on inputs from simpler processes. Skills beget skills. We need those simpler skills to support higher order skills. So if we wait until age 6 to do something, and if these lower regions are not getting set up well, we're playing incredible catch-up to try to get the brain functioning at top speed. Okay? So if I have convinced you, I hope I have briefly, there's a longer version of this talk, by the way, which I could give to you later. Stimulation is needed to develop a healthy brain. Has to have something to think about so that it can wire itself up well. The brain will become what the brain does. And that's another thing to think about, because if the brain does fear, the brain will become very good at fear, for example. But the brain needs stimulation, and you got to wonder what nature was thinking. Human infants who really have the most complex brains are born unable to provide themselves with the stimulation that they need in order to shape a healthy brain. We can't roll over, we can't get our silly hand to our mouth, we can't even, turn very easily at birth. So without the support of others, we are really at risk for a lot of disturbances in the way our brains develop. But of course, we have evolved to be born into the context of relationships. Brain development occurs in that context. And in that context, with parents and brothers and sisters and peers, we have a rich variety of stimulation. And in fact, from that very helpless infant, right, I know many that run entire households, right? So in the context of supportive relationships, babies, in a sense, have the opportunity to regulate what their brains are going to think about. Today, I'm interested in lights. I'm only happy if I'm looking at lights. Okay, I'm looking at lights. Great, great. Now I'm getting bored with lights. And now I want to look at edges. Okay. And they guide us towards what their brains are putting together in many respects. But it takes a responsive and supportive environment to provide that kind of support. And that's a lot of what you all are working on, is how to shore up families and grandparents and so on so that they can provide that supportive environment for their children. We talk about this as sensitive and responsive interaction, but you can also talk about it as serve and return, if you want to give folks an idea of what this is like. So it's like playing ball with a young child. Children serve, a smile, a fuss, a this. We return a response, and in serving and returning, we set up that kind of interaction that literally will sculpt the way the brain develops. Now, this is a natural process for children. Children will do this unless we stop returning the ball. Or in intrusive families or in situations, it may be that the adults are sending curveballs to the kid, right? The kid serves and then something gets lost and the kid can't keep it going. So what we're working with parents is, and others who are working with young children, is creating this kind of smooth serve and return. So a baby's serve is returned in a way that can keep interactions going. And of course, that's easier to do with someone that you know. I don't know if you've ever tried to play ball with a 3-year-old you've just met. It's really tough. It's even hard with one you know, but it's much better if you know what their signals mean. So it's really, really hard for kids to move from one context to another, to another, to another. This is one of the things you worry about a lot when you're in child protection, right? You may need to move the child to protect them, but please let's not bounce them from one home to the next. They can't handle that. It's really hard for brain development because they're constantly playing serve and return with people they don't know and can't get that song and dance going well. Okay, so barriers, no surprise given this, that the barriers for educational achievement begin to emerge early. That doesn't mean they're set, but it means we can begin to see skill begetting skill, setting kids off into different courses. This is an old study, but every study that has come after it has verified this. This is about language development. And the language you know opens up concepts, right? If you have a word for an idea, you can think about an idea. So the larger your vocabulary, the larger your vocabulary, if that makes a sense. So we begin to look, this is a study that was done in 1995, at the number of words that children knew in families where the parents were not educated and were low income, in families where there was a high school education, and in families where there were college education. They took the number of words the child was producing. At 16 months, there's not much difference, though I will tell you in studies that go back and look at what words children know, not that they can produce, but that they know. They can do this with eye tracking and wild things. This is early. You can take this back to 12 months. Then there's this explosion of word learning and production between 12 and 24 months, or 16 and 24 months, and then by 36 months, this is the size of the achievement gap that we face in school. It's beginning much earlier than 4 years of age. This is why Art Rolnick and I and others have been talking to the legislature about let's not wait. Let's try to create supportive and enriching environments for young children earlier so that we don't need to play catch up when they get to school. So, what have I told you so far? The architecture of the brain is shaped by our experiences. Brain architecture develops in the context of relationship. That kind of serve and return provides the basic experiences that literally help build the brain. Skills beget skills. Simpler skills support later developing skills. You get off course early, you're going to have to play catch up. A poor early foundation, therefore, begins to affect all that comes after, and the achievement gap begins early. Not that we can't fix it, but it begins early. Now, the next part of this, I'm going to talk about what we focus on. So much of what we're focusing on here is the architecture of memory and learning, the stuff we think that kids need in school. So we're focusing on this hippocampus that helps us remember facts and figures, the prefrontal cortex that helps us think and reason and hold things in memory, and the amygdala that tells us what's important. And these are the things that we talk a lot about. The problem or the challenge is that these learning areas are also our emotion areas. We tend to separate school learning and emotion, right? But they are intertwined. It's not that exactly the same areas are doing both things, but they're interconnections. So that if I am frightened, I shift the way my hippocampus remembers things. I remember things that are dangerous, way good. And I take offline parts of my prefrontal cortex that are there for reflection, and I shift into an act now, think later kind of mode, because that's important for survival. Experience sculpts these brain regions and tips us towards, we have genetics that also, some people are born a little more anxious and some are less anxious, but experience will also shape this. So over time, it's a balancing act. If our experiences have tended to be positive, if they've tended to show us that the world is a safe place, then when given an ambiguous situation, we will more likely see the positive components of it. But if the world has told us that our experience have told us the world is a dangerous place, then we will shape the regions of our brain that help us to detect danger, and they will operate at a very low threshold. They'll kick in, and they will shift us from a reasoning and reflective mode into an act now, think later mode, it's important. Nature isn't out to get us. This is really important. If you grow up in harsh situations, you may need to have that. But you also would need the opportunity to shut that down if you were moving into a learning context. And it would really help teachers, I think, to understand that this child that is wild and acting out, they may need to work on helping that child feel more and more protected so that that child's brain doesn't shift into that. It's a different way of coming at it that neuroscience is beginning to lead us to think about. Now, everything I have told you should make you like totally anxious about negative, harsh, stressful things. But before I get there, I want to talk about 3 levels of stress, because there is positive stress. We do not want to bubble wrap children, right? That having some degree of challenge, of failure, of being anxious and worried a little bit about things, and learning that you can manage them with the support of the people around you is very important for resilience, as Anne will probably tell you. It's also possible to think about tolerable stress. These are very highly stressful contexts for kids, ones that, given our druthers, we would not want them to have to go through: death of a parent, being in a car accident, some natural catastrophe. But again, as Anne is probably going to tell you, these can be tolerable if there's a good supportive care system around the child. And in my own research, I've shown that, in fact, the stress hormones that sculpt the brain actually stay fairly quiescent in young children under even high stress conditions with supportive care. It blocks the production of those. What we're worried about is toxic stress. That's the activation of the stress systems of the body that frequently and at high levels in ways that will then lead to a sculpting of the brain in challenging ways. And I don't know what happened to one of my slides. I'm a little confused here, but we'll see if I can find it. We know the kinds of situations that are likely to give rise. They don't necessarily give rise to this, but neglect, abuse, exposure to violence, these are the kinds of high-risk situations where if we could provide that supportive care, we could probably block the activation of these stress systems. But in the absence of that care, or when the very people that are there to provide support are also scary, there's the conflict, right? Then we see that these are the situations that have pretty powerful effects on brain development. And one way to look at that is to look at when kids fall behind on their developmental tasks. This is a study of children who were in the Child Protective Service system in, I believe it was in Maryland, and they looked at the percentage of 3-year-olds who had fallen significantly behind on the developmental tasks. And since we do these tasks guided by our brain, right, not our big toe, this is an index of how the brain is developing. So with 1, 2, or 3 risk factors, we're seeing some kids falling behind. But what's critical is that by the time we get to 6 or 7 risk factors in a child's life, most of them have fallen behind. We're talking about significant impacts. Now, you all are focusing, I think, a lot on not only getting kids ready for school and getting families supported, but also on issues of health. One of the things that we've tried to do, or we've recognized in this area, is that what we're talking about in early development is not just about getting kids ready for school, or not just about helping them with mental health issues. The issues actually affect lifelong health. And one of the big surprises of the last decade to 15 years is that we can look at diseases of aging, metabolic syndrome, having high blood pressure and high cholesterol and being at risk for heart attacks and stroke. And we find that that actually is linked to the level of unsupported level of toxic stress that you were exposed to early in childhood. Now, there are other factors as well. So if you get a heart attack, it's not because solely you were exposed to toxic stress. But just like any other risk factor, smoking is a risk factor for lung disease, right? Doing it or being exposed to it increases the odds. And what we've seen, and this is a huge study done in California with people who had health care, this is a Kaiser Permanente health system, is that if they had 0, 1, or 2 adverse experiences in their childhood, not much of an increase in risk for cardiovascular disease. But as you began to add up those risks, a threefold increase, if you are coming from a background with lots of risk factors, even if you've made it into the middle class here and you have Kaiser healthcare, right? So it's not just about getting ready for school. It actually goes longer, and we hope we can bring in more of the state's agencies to be involved in thinking about early care if we recognize that this is also contributing to the cost of health care in our state, and not just for kids, but for older people as well. Okay, how do we get these connections? It's not just magic. The research on stress and stress biology helps us understand how these connections, some of these connections may be made. One of the things now that we're very clear on, at least in animal models, and since we probably weren't dropped out of some strange place, the evidence we're getting on humans, which should not be as detailed, is following suit. And what we know now is that the hormones that are produced when our bodies are under stress literally change the architecture of the brain. So here's an example. What you're looking at here is a normal pyramidal nerve cell from either the hippocampus, that area that helps you remember things, or your prefrontal cortex, the reason that helps you plan and regulate your behavior. This is what it would normally look like, and I want you to focus on the fact that it's got a lot of nice little connections. This is what it looks like under chronic stress. So in animals where you have stressed them every day for 2 weeks, or just put the stress hormones into the brain, you lose connections. And if we were to look actually on look on these and see those little knobby things, that's what a synapse actually looks like. You've probably heard about synapses. Those are the points of connection between cells. So you can see this one's got all sorts, and what's happened here is they're gone. Now, nature doesn't hate you. So the reason that this is happening is these stress chemicals are toxic potentially to brain cells. They rev them up and make them work really hard, which you need to do when you're under stress, but you can work so hard that you die. And so what is happening here is under chronic stress, you're actually pulling back synapses to protect the nerve cell. And then if you get out of stress for several weeks or a month, this is the reason you need vacations, guys, these connections will come back. Now, this is what happens in an adult. In an aging adult, it's harder to get the connections back. And in a young child, remember, skills beget skills. So if the brain is organizing itself on top of cells that have been retracted, it's not processed, and it gets built in to the system in a way that will lead you to have trouble holding on to reasoning ways, rational, reflective ways of operating. Now, remember that a little pink thing, amygdala, I showed you? That's an emotion processing center in the brain. The opposite effect happens there. You actually increase the number of connections that you have under chronic stress, and it doesn't go away. So what the brain is doing, right, is if your life is stressful, you're increasing your ability to detect stress and to react to it quickly. Okay? So we know that these are problems for young children. This is data from my own lab, as well as a lab in Delaware and in Oregon. I've been looking at children adopted from orphanages, and my friends in Delaware and Oregon have been looking at children in Child Protective Service system. And what we know is if we look at middle-class toddlers and the levels of this stress hormone, only about 5% of them on any given day look like there's something going on with that system, and that's probably just noise. What we see for children who are neglected is that about 30, sometimes 35% of them show a frank disordering in that system, indicating that they're under chronic stress of the kind that could shape the brain in this way. When we've looked at children who have been adopted out of orphanages, we look at them 10, 11 years after they've gotten into their upper middle class families who are doing everything for them. So they came from deprivation early. We look at them years later after all kinds of support. We've looked at the size of the hippocampus, that region, remember, that was retracting under chronic stress. And what we see is these are Minnesota controls. These are children adopted between 4 and 12 months of age. And these are the ones that didn't get to supportive families until they were 1 to 5. So years later, we're seeing the signature in the brain that now, there are many ways of getting around this. You can learn to use the brains you have more efficiently. And that's also what we seem to be seeing. Many of these kids are learning strategies and ways of getting these problems done using their brains more efficiently. But we do think we're seeing the impact being carried forward for a very long period of time. And we also know that stress, I should get done here, stress impacts the immune system. We got to get to that cardiovascular disease. Some of you may have gone to the doctor and they've checked your C-reactive protein levels as a way of looking at whether you've got running low-grade inflammation, which we know with aging is a risk for a heart attack. This is a study of kids in Dunedin, New Zealand. They followed all the kids. The kids in this study now are 32. They followed them over the time. They knew which children were being reared in homes that were not abusive. They knew which children had been maltreated as children and the ones that were maltreated and had developed depression. And what you're seeing is a marked increase in the presence at age 32 of chronic elevations in C-reactive protein and inflammatory measures that may be part of what's carrying forward. These measures of inflammation, by the way, again, nature doesn't hate you, but if you start to bleed, having higher levels stops the bleeding. So you're designing a body that will survive to reproduction under conditions where there's a lot of harshness. You could get attacked by a lion or, whatever it was. And you need to act now, think later, and heal quickly. But nonetheless, you're setting up an organism that is paying later in life for just trying to do basic survival earlier. So this has led to a real change in our thinking about early experiences and their role in health. There's a biological embedding that happens early in life when you're exposed to toxic stress. I haven't talked about environmental exposures, but those are important, suffering malnutrition. And this creates a cumulative burden potentially over time unless we can intervene to provide support, producing disruptions in biological systems that are important for our health and well-being, and ultimately helping explain why individuals who grow up and live under harsh conditions, lower SES, have a shorter lifespan. So how do we act on this appalling science, right? Clearly getting it right the first time would be really nice, and the better we can do that, the better off we are. Bringing the basic principles of neuroscience, indicating that early intervention and getting things right from the beginning is likely to be more effective and more cost-effective than starting later. It's also more effective for brains. It's easier to shape them. They're set to be shaped early on. Otherwise, we're retooling those brains. And for our society, the costs of remedial education, clinical treatment, and crime are enormous. But research says, too, that remediation and prevention are possible. So we do not take the 5-year-old and say, whoops, all done for you, right? There are ways that we can engage in remediation, and that's what my colleague Ann Maston is going to potentially bring to you. We've learned a lot by looking, not all kids, right? This is averages. These are risk factors. There are many children that go through these kinds of experiences and come out on the other side and do quite well, or at least some. And if we can learn what supported them, what helped them get through that, then those are clues for the kinds of things that you all can do to support the development of children who are growing up in high-risk circumstances. So I want to thank you for inviting me. And there are 2 websites. One of them that you can go to is Project for Babies. There's a really nice set of engaging videos that tell the core story of development, tell you what I've told, but with cute pictures of kids and a few of us talking. It's all the same information, but easier to digest, I think. And then you can also go to the Institute of Child Development's website as well. Thank you.